This is a Willets Point Shea Stadium bound 7 express train. The next and last stop is Willets Point, Shea Stadium.
Darryl Strawberry, 8 years, from 1983 to 1990, 263 batting average, 252 home runs, 733 RBIs, Rookie of the Year, 7-time All-Star as a Met, 2-time Silver Slugger as a Met. He finished second in the MVP voting in 88, third in 1990. Then you go to Dwight Gooden, 11 years with the Mets, 84 to 94. 157 and 85 with a 3.10 ERA, Rookie of the Year, 4-time All-Star, Cy Young. He had the ERA title as well in 85 and the pitching triple crown, which was in 1985, 24 wins, 153 ERA and 268 strikeouts. I want to go back to the beginning because it's definitely relevant to today. We kind of are spoiled now that we get to see these prospects grow before our eyes with the internet and getting to see clips of them almost daily. So when and how did you first start, hearing about Doc and Darryl being on the rise and how big, I guess, the hype was, the anticipation for their arrival?
Okay. First, I have to take a damp cloth and dab my forehead from the ecstasy I'm feeling hearing those statistics and being reminded just how great those players' careers were. Uh, you know, Darryl Strawberry rose to Mets fan consciousness probably the moment he rose to the consciousness of every baseball fan who picked up a copy of the 1980 Sports Illustrated Baseball preview issue, because therein was a sidebar to an article called Stars of the 80s, which was highlighting those players who at the time were the young and rising stars of baseball. One of whom was Keith Hernandez, by the way, who had just won the batting title, who was on the cover of that issue. But there's a sidebar of this high school kid in Southern California named Darryl Strawberry. And it was pointed out that Darryl Strawberry was eligible to be the number one pick in the nation in the June draft. The June draft, by the way, was not a huge deal at the time, as much as the June draft pales in comparison to this day to what they do in the NFL and the NBA. It was a whole lot smaller on the radar compared to what it is now and what it has become over the years. But once in a while, you would hear about a player. And if you were a Mets fan, you would fantasize, I wonder if we can get that player. And then you realized, you know what? The Mets had the worst record in the National League last year. I do believe the Mets have the first pick in the draft this year. As a result, they used to alternate it by leagues. So all I'm thinking at that point in April of 1980 is, I hope they don't do something ridiculous and pick somebody else, because this guy sounds too good to be true. Mind you, based on this one article, because there was an echo chamber that developed thereafter where anytime you'd read anything about the upcoming draft, Darryl Strawberry's name continued to be mentioned. There were a few others, one of whom was Billy Beane. And there was some talk, well, maybe the Mets will take Billy Beane with that first pick. And I'm thinking, don't do that. pick the right guy. Mind you, I've never seen either one of them. And as it happens, that June, the Mets do pick Darryl Strawberry with that number one pick. And Billy Beane is still available, and the Mets have extra picks in the first round because of compensation for free agent signings. And they do get Billy Beane, among others. So Strawberry is right there as the future from that moment forward, once he is a part of the Mets organization. And this won't sound like a lot to the modern ear, because we see how SNY, for example, after every single game brings us highlights of Down on the Farm Tonight. And you would think every top prospect we have is batting 1,000, because they never show you anything where they're not doing something great. Newsday, I remember, sent a reporter to Kingsport, Tennessee to cover Darryl Strawberry's professional debut. No paper ever sent anybody to cover anything in the minor leagues in those days. So right away, it was a big deal. And of course, anytime you would hear about Darryl Strawberry between 1980 and that moment in May of 1983 when he came up, you're just thinking, did he hit another home run? And you were a little distressed if you heard that, well, he's having some problems developing, struggling, as all young players do, because all you were waiting on was Darryl Strawberry. And, I can tell you this I think I'm right about this. I know I'm right from the part that we can prove, or at least experientially prove. We've never looked forward to any prospect coming to the major leagues the way we look forward to Darryl Strawberry. That includes Greg Jeffries, who I know was hugely hyped. That includes Jose Reyes and David Wright. It was just our future depended on it. And the part I can prove is that we will never again have a Darryl Strawberry, that towering a figure making that much of a difference to our perception. Again, we didn't know. We didn't know that if he was going to turn out to be a great player. We didn't know if he was going to turn out to be Sean Abner, another number one pick in the nation who we wound up trading and didn't really turn out to have a great major league career. But those first few years in the minors, it felt like you were a Mets fan on two levels in those days. You were a Mets fan for whoever was on the 80, 81, 82, 83 Mets before May. And you wanted to know when Darryl Strawberry would get here. Um, Dwight Gooden, I don't recall quite the same breathless anticipation for. That might be just me. I don't remember a whole lot of coverage. I mean, his name was obviously reported in the papers when they drafted him, and by the time that he was like really getting people's attention, I was in college at that moment and may have missed. I think it was 17-4, 19-4, something like that at Lynchburg, and then they bring him up to pitch in the Little World Series for AAA. And I still remember the first time I had a real concept of who he was, or at least a quasi concept. I lived across the hall from somebody else. I went to school out of town in Tampa, oddly enough, where Dwight Gooden is from. And I lived across the hall from a guy also from New York. And he said to me, "You must be real excited about Dr. D." And I was like, "Who's Dr. D?" I was thinking, is that what they call Ron Darling? Because he had just come up. No, man, Dwight Gooden. No, he's supposed to be great. Dr. K. Well, he knew more about him than I did at that point. So, the hype really came when he shows up in spring training the next year with the major league team. 19 years old. The legend is correct about that. And he's setting down major leaguers and he's making the case to be brought to the team. And whatever organizational machinations there were about, bring 19-year-olds up to start the season just went out the window. Because you got to remember that entering 84, again, we had Darryl Strawberry, his rookie of the year season. The Mets had begun to make a little bit of noise during that season. It's the same season, as I mentioned, they bring up Darling, they acquire Hernandez. They're still a last place team. You know things are changing. You're sore of them for letting Seaver go, by the way, because he was drafted that offseason, an unnecessary move, also about free agent compensation. But okay, again, spring training 84. We have been waiting to get good again forever. And Dwight Gooden may be the key to that. So as a fan, you're thinking, please tell me he's ready. And Davey Johnson won that argument over Frank Ashen. And so that's how Dwight enters the picture. And the two of them in combination with Hernandez and a whole bunch of players, there was a bunch of good players on that 84 team, they finally break through. And we are now in that era that we are celebrating with this announcement.
Well, I want to go back to 1980, right? That's when Darryl gets drafted. It's really the beginning of a new era. The Wilpons and Doubleday, they take over ownership of the team. Did it really feel like at the time this was a start of a new era? Kind of like how when Steve Cohen took over for the Wilpons back in 2020, you kind of felt that, you know what, maybe we're going in the different direction now and it's, more positive. Did it feel that way? Because I know the last couple of years of the Wilpons, they were bad, but I don't think they were as bad as that 77, 8, 9 seasons for the Mets, where it was Grant's tomb.
Yeah, it was a more binary time. You're either good or bad, it felt like, as a baseball team. As you know, there were no wild cards. So you knew if you were contending or not. You were not contending in 1977, 78, 79. The bottom had completely fallen out of the New York Mets enterprise. Nelson Doubleday, and to a lesser extent, Fred Wilpon, because he just wasn't really put out there quite as much as the face of the franchise. they were greeted as saviors because, again, the ownership, which was post Mrs. Payson, post, thank God, M. Donald Grant, and now about to be post Mrs. DeRolay, Joan Payson's daughter, who had overseen the running of the organization into the ground. They're all gone. We have this new infusion of capital, this new infusion of optimism, of talking to what the Mets mean. Uh, as you know, I co-host a podcast called National League Town. That name is not taken lightly. One of the things that Wilpon and Doubleday talked about, and then Frank Cashin, when they hired him to be GM, was, you know, the fact that this is New York's National League franchise, that this was traditionally a National League town, and that we want to get that goodwill back, and we want to build this organization into something that will bring people back to Shea Stadium and remember why they cared about the Mets in the first place. The last 3 years had been that brutal that it was a ghost town, and there was just this permeating sense of hopelessness. Now you have to remember, June of 1980, when it's time to make that pick, the Mets are beginning to show signs of life on the field. A phrase I'm sure you've heard in your life: "The magic is back." That was the advertising slogan, which at first was laughed at that spring because what they were trying to say was, and they ran ads with pictures of Jackie Robinson and pictures of Ralph Branca looking very depressed after giving up Bobby Thompson's home run, which I think told you something about where Fred Wilpon's allegiance lied, because you probably should have shown Bobby Thompson being happy if you're trying to appeal to New York National League Giant and Dodger fans, those memories. But I don't think it was so much getting guys from the field park. The idea was, we're going to make you proud again. We're going to make you feel something again. And it was laughed at because we mean the magic is back. They lost 9 games last year and they got off to a hard start. But then out of nowhere, they started playing beautiful baseball. And people like me, who were 17 at the time, believed, like, that's it. We're here. This is it. And the fact that it was a new ownership, and the fact they were painting the ballpark and putting in new seats and all that sort of thing, it all seemed like, the dawning of the age of Aquarius, if you will. And then you put on top of this team that's flirting with 500 and only 5-6 games out of first place, this Darryl Strawberry character. So it's all going to be great. This is indeed a new era. And then, in a matter of months, all you were really feeling out of all of that was, well, the seats are and the paint job is new, and Darryl Strawberry's coming, because the 1980 Mets fell apart because they weren't really that good. And the new era thing had to go through the ringer because 81 was a terrible year. There's a strike in the middle of that. And 82, they make some big moves, but it doesn't really help. And again, you get to the just near Darryl Strawberry's debut, and they're still a terrible team, even though they brought back Tom Seaver before letting him get away. And they have George Foster and Dave Kingman, who they had brought back, and little pieces here and there. Mookie Wilson was now on the team, and we saw that he was a talent and could do things. And we had glimpses of Wally Backman and Hubie Brooks and people like that. But the team was nowhere after entering its fourth season under this ownership. So patience had worn thin. If you go back and look at the attendance figures, as one does, from game to game, after Seaver comes back, it's a sellout almost. And then there's nobody ballpark again for a solid month, basically. And then they bring up Darryl Strawberry, and attendance triples overnight, which is to say it went from 5,000 to 15,000. That's not an exaggeration, but it was something. And Strawberry was the first legitimate sign that the new era was working in practice as well as theory, as well as mood. And, again, the Hernan is another big part of that. So they were doing what needed to do. When I say they, ownership and management, Frank Cashin at the front of it, they drafted the right guy to get people excited and to produce once the excitement wore off, once the novelty of having a player named Strawberry wore off.
Now, you look back in Mets history, and you mentioned how Strawberry, was even bigger than coming up than Reyes and Wright was. And you look from the inception of this team to the 80s, and Darryl really was the first, hitter, slugger that they developed, was kind of this five-tool star. When Darryl came up, what was that moment where you were like, yeah, this guy's the real deal?
Well, he comes up on a Friday night, and of course you want him to hit a home run every time he comes up, and he doesn't hit a home run that night. He had one foul to almost win the game, and I believe it was extra innings. Didn't quite stay fair, but he walks, he steals a base, he ends up scoring on George Foster's. Uh, excuse me, yes, it was George. I believe George Foster hit the game that night. Dave Kingman hit the game tying homer. It's a hell of a game. Whoever did what, but you saw the fact that he had the speed as well as the power that had been ballyhooed. You saw early in the first month, the first game where I actually saw him later in May. Saw him throw guys out at the plate. You saw this whole idea of five-tool player wasn't one that I'm sure it existed before that, but it wasn't one that I've around all that much when I was growing up, probably because the Mets never had one. The Mets never had that power hitting. Had that. They had Cleon Jones was a really good hitter, but he was not what you'd call a power hitter. He was developed from within. And once you got past Cleon Jones in terms of developing hitters, they just didn't. They developed some good players. Bud Harrelson was a terrific defensive shortstop who was not helpless with the bat, but that's not the same thing. So when you got to Darryl Strawberry, this was, the next species of Met, you might say. Like, we never saw anybody like this. We saw it on other teams. We saw other teams had guys who could hit home runs and steal bases and make great throws and had the capability to make great catches. With Darryl, we had that all in one. So, he struggled at first because he may not have been 100% ready the way not too many rookies are. But you gave him a couple of months to get his feet wet. You let him sit against some tougher left-handers, but after a while, he's in there every day, and he's figuring it out. And he has Keith Hernandez next to him on the bench for whatever that's worth, as far as having somebody to mentor him a little bit in a baseball sense. You had Rusty Staub on that team, serve something of the same purpose. And you begin to, as a professional, mold your talent and get a little savvy. And when he wins Rookie of the Year, that wasn't fait accompli necessarily because he had gotten off to kind of a crummy start. But you look from basically the end of June to the end of the season, and you take his statistics and you double them. Those are MVP numbers. The Mets were not the kind of club where anybody was saying they've got valuable players because they're such a good team. No, they were still a last place team. But Darryl was on his way, and there'll still be fits and starts for a couple of years, but him in the middle of that lineup is different from anything the Mets had before, and adding to that lineup, became the mission after a while. And after '84, you have Gary Carter, and suddenly you have most of the team that New York remembers and fell in love with.
Yeah, adding to the lineup, something that I hope they do with Pete Alonso in the middle of the lineup as well, which I hope that they do re-sign him at some point and build around him and Lindor instead of people talking about trading him all so much. Once again, I'm here with Greg Prince, author of many Mets books, and you can catch his words on the Faith and Fear in Flushing blog, as well as hear his voice on the National League Town podcast. Greg, Doc comes up, he wins 17 games and Rookie of the Year to start. But it's really that 1985 season that really lit up New York and made the Mets must watch every fifth day, 24-4 with a 1.53 ERA. Is that 1985 run by Doc the best pitch season in Mets baseball? I know there could be a lot of debate about this because, you can't talk Mets pitching without talking about the franchise, Tom Seaver. But, you look at the stats and maybe I think 1969 may have been Seaver's best season, 25-7 with a 2.21 ERA. Maybe it's better. I didn't get to see either. So I'm leaning on, your expertise here. What do you think? Is that Doc season the best season of all time?
What a pleasant choice to make between Tom Seaver and Dwight Gooden. This is a lot different from Buck Showalter filling out the bottom of his lineup card, wondering, do I put Danny Mendick or Jose Arias in there tonight? Um, I came along late in '69, so to me, Seaver was a matinee idol at the time. I couldn't tell you the ins and outs of every start. I watched him pretty closely in '71. I'll always think of that as his greatest season with the 1.76 ERA and not enough run support to get 20 wins until the final day of the season and then be jobbed out of a Cy Young when they gave it to Fergie Jenkins. A great pitcher nonetheless. Um, that said, and the fact that Tom Seaver remained my idol and does so to this day, even in absentia. Yeah, I never experienced anything like Dwight Gooden's 1985. Uh, the fact that he was only 20 years old, he was coming off, it's a cliche now, but it was an electrifying rookie season where we took that guy who I talked about earlier who lit up spring training and he makes a case for himself to be on the All-Star team, strikes out the side in the All-Star game in '84, and is beginning to run into just a little bit of maybe he's out of gas, maybe they're getting the best of a young pitcher. And then you get to August and he turns it on like crazy and he strikes out 16 a couple of times. He throws what was probably the first no-hitter in Mets history, but for a scoring decision on an infield hit. And you leave that season where he goes 17-9 and wins Rookie of the Year and comes in second in the Cy Young voting. And you ask, well, what's next? And what's next was the numbers that you quoted: 24-4, 1.53. And the numbers don't quite do it justice somehow. Because I sat down a couple of years ago for an article and thought about how, when we talk about, oh, that's the greatest pitching performance in Mets history, whether you're talking about something like the one hitter, the imperfect game that Seaver threw, or the 10 strikeouts in a row that he threw en route to 19, or Bobby Jones's one hitter in the playoffs, Al Leiter's two hitter to clinch the playoffs, but things like that. And I was thinking how we never really bring up a Dwight Gooden start specifically, that one time that he did this or that. And I realized the greatest pitching performance, more so than the greatest pitching season, may be Dwight Gooden's 1985, because it was just one long chain of practically uninterrupted excellence for, I think it was 35 starts. And you go and look at the September of that year. This is after he's already won 20 games. This is after he's already had amazing starts, amazing streaks. He broke Tom Seaver's in-season consecutive wins streak in August. The same day Seaver wins number 300 at Yankee Stadium, incidentally. The Mets are in the pennant race of their lives, as far as I'm concerned, in September of '85. Doc has 5 starts. His earned run average throughout September is 0.00. He throws either complete games or games that 9 innings, and then the games go into extra innings, and they decided they didn't want to push him any further. The one game that he doesn't finish, he goes 8 innings and he hits a 3-run homer during, and they win by 11. So you don't need to use him. As they're beginning to fall out of the race a little bit at the end of September, he throws a shutout as if it is routine in Chicago and keeps them alive long enough to go to St. Louis with a chance to win in the first week of October, or a chance to tie the Cardinals, I should say. So the entire season is like the entire season of worrying and wondering the way you do when your team is in that kind of a race, because they're never more than 3 games ahead of the Cardinals, or no, I think it was 1 game ahead of the Cardinals or 3 games behind the Cardinals for about 3 months, something like that. It is just, nip and tuck, hammer and tong, every cliche you can think of. And, you trust Darling, but you're not sure he's going to throw a great game. You trust Sid Fernandez. You're not sure he's going to throw a great game. You hope for the best out of Ed Lynch and Rick Aguilera and anybody else they happen to have to start. And then Dwight Gooden pitches. And it's like, okay, we got to score a run. If we score a run, we're good. If we score 2 runs, we're great. And that's what it was like for all but a handful of 35 starts that year. So the fact that he's still only 20, and the fact that it is a red hot pennant race, And by the way, there's some great pitching in the National League that year. It's never talked about as the year of the pitcher. Go look at John Tudor's game by game, especially from June on. John Tudor had almost every bit as good a season as Gooden that year. Fernando Valenzuela, who was not exactly a veteran at that point, but it had some ups and downs. He has a renaissance that year. There are a few other pitchers who do incredible things, but Doc is so far above the crowd. He wins the Cy Young unanimously. If we had any kind of handle on metrics the way we do now, he would have won the MVP as well. I think he finished fourth because God forbid you give a pitcher the most valuable player award. And again, just the sense that okay, he is the greatest pitcher who's ever lived. It might be a slight exaggeration, but not by much. You felt like in your mind, maybe you were skipping over Seaver and going back to Koufax. You were going back to Gibson's 1.12 year. Certainly, you're making room alongside Seaver in your mind as the greatest Met who's ever been. There's no doubt number 16 will be up there someday. You're not thinking about it in 1985 because he's 20 years old, but he is at that level. And the only thing I've seen like it since then, mastery of the game from the mound, was Jacob deGrom for a few years. And we know that Jacob deGrom didn't throw complete games because that's not what baseball is today. We know that Jacob deGrom, unfortunately, had a hard time staying in one piece. I'm not making it sound like it's his fault. It's just the way it turned out. Although he had an in common, not being scored for. Oh, go back and look at some of Seaver's and Gooden's starts, and it's like, oh, this didn't just start with Jacob deGrom. But Gooden with those 2 years, and then into the beginning of '86. There is a 50 start span in his career. I believe the dates were August 11th of '84 to May 6th of '86. I went back and reread this the other day, so I'm not quite nuts enough to carry this information around with me all the time. Gooden went 37-5. And the ERA, I believe, was under that 1.53. It was like 1.4 maybe. I mean, he was just unhittable for what amounted to a year and a half. And there was, I just said unhittable, but really hardly. There was a hitter who could touch him. It was news. You may remember Met hitting coach from a couple of years ago, Chili Davis. Chili Davis gained a measure of renown as the guy who could hit Dwight Gooden. It was that unusual. His famous quote was, because he was asked, how did you get that hit off of Dwight Gooden? He said, he ain't God, man. Well, most other National League batters were under the impression he was. I think Tim Wallach of the Expos was another guy who had some success against him. But the fact that you can pick names out of hundreds of players, it's like this is like a very difficult version of Immaculate Grid where you can't come up with an answer for National League hitter and National League hitter who could hit Dwight Gooden, because it was that uncommon. And then it began to tail off. But during that period encompassing all of '85, no, never saw anything like it. Not among Met pitchers, and I won't claim to have watched every other team's pitchers closely. Hardly any season has felt of a piece with Dwight Gooden's '85.
Seaver definitely had more brilliant seasons than Gooden had, but you get to compare one of those good seasons to each other, and you got a good debate there. And you could have, even if all things had worked out, that 2021 season, that start that Jacob deGrom went on, where we were talking about the year of the pitcher, Gibson stuff, you could add that season to it if he could have stayed healthy. Unfortunately, he couldn't. Another name that has come up in the number retirement rumors is Gary Carter. And we're going to get into that topic shortly. But pertaining to Dwight Gooden, how important was Gary Carter to the maturation of Doc as a pitcher?
Well, I can only go mostly by what Dwight Gooden has had to say. And he gives Gary Carter all the credit in the world for bringing him along through 1985 and some of the years beyond. Not that Doc needed that much help, it seemed, in '84. Remember, his catcher that year was mostly Mike Fitzgerald, another rookie, with an assist in a way from the first baseman, Keith Hernandez, who it was said wore out a path between first and the pitcher's mound because Mike Fitzgerald didn't know the league. Keith Hernandez did, but he wasn't a catcher. So you bring Gary Carter in there, And in addition to being a guy who's capable of hitting 30 or so home runs, which was a huge thing in those days, and driving in 100 or so runs, again, a huge thing in those days, and not a bad thing to have now. You had an all around terrific defensive catcher who knew the league really well, who'd been at it for about 10 years, who still had some prime left. But, putting aside Carter's defense and putting aside Carter's hitting, um, he knew how to handle pitchers. They've all, when I say they, the members of that rotation have all talked about that. So you're already at the top of the league in the rarefied air with Mike Fitzgerald as your catcher. No offense to Mike Fitzgerald. You bring in Gary Carter, you're going to go to another league if you've got that trust and that communication between pitcher and catcher, and obviously they did. And I tell you, I mentioned the MVP voting of 1985. Had I had a vote back in the day, long before looking at anybody's wins above replacement, I would have given co-MVP to Carter and Gooden. They both had incredible September, early October, and lifted that team a little further maybe than it should have been, because the Cardinals were just insane that year. They ended up giving it to Willie McGee, who had a great year, hit 353, I want to say. But, Carter transformed that team on top of Gooden and Strawberry and Hernandez and all they had done. So that was a brilliant acquisition in more ways, I think, than are generally accepted.
It's always frustrating to look back at the what could have been, but in all honesty, these two, Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, they were on track for the Hall of Fame, right? If you look back from that time, that late 80s time, those guys look like they were on track. If they could have stayed, clean, stayed healthy, they would have been Hall of Famers.
Yeah, sure seemed like it. The funny thing is, we automatically turn our focus to '86 when we talk about that era, and rightly so. But neither one of those players was at his absolute Met peak in '86. I mean, 84 and 85, we've just talked about with Gooden, and he would remain a very good pitcher, sometimes great pitcher for years to come. I think that's often a little overlooked. In Strawberry's case, he was this dangerous hitter who would go into funks from 83, 84, missed some time in 85 with an injury, which is probably why they didn't win the division. And 86, he had a really bad August at home, I remember. And there is video evidence of him being booed, I'm sure. Starting in 87, he moved to another level. And by 90, the year before the final regular season before he leaves for free agency, because Frank Cashin did not want to pay an exorbitant amount to any baseball player, it seemed. He lifted the Mets on his shoulders, and they nearly won the division as a result. He should have been the MVP in '88. The writers got enchanted with Kirk Gibson being this gritty, gutty guy. And in '87, you really could have made a case, because '87 is the year Doc goes to rehab. And Strawberry really comes into his own. He had some injuries in '89, but he had good numbers. What I'm saying is that they both were on a pace. And the reason I dive in briefly to Strawberry there is I'm thinking back to a talk I came across a few years ago online of Bob Murphy, 1990. He's at the Learning Annex, and people have paid money to sit and listen to Bob Murphy talk about the Mets and talk about baseball. And it's just absolutely marvelous to listen to for a number of reasons. But one of them, again, this is 1990, so we're talking Doc's 7th year. And he's saying just very matter-of-factly how Dwight Gooden is going to the Hall of Fame. It's not, nobody's gasping, nobody's thinking, what the hell is Murph talking about? It was obvious. So, Gooden comes up against injuries in the middle of 91. He's never quite the same on the mound. We know that he has the second suspension for cocaine, and he's never quite the same, save for a couple of nights in the Bronx and a little some good times with Cleveland. But yeah, that is the might have been, both of them, because Strawberry went to Los Angeles, had the one really good year, and then he has injuries and personal problems and all of that, and then he's a role player with the Yankees and helps them win. Isn't that great for us? Uh, so these are two careers. If you didn't know who they were and you just looked at their numbers, you'd say these are already, if not exactly borderline. If you were in a generous mood, you'd say, well, I can see their candidacies. And then you throw in from the positive side, who they were, because they really meant everything in the scheme of the 1980s Mets. And those years, even those years after '86, which are often sort of like dusted to the side in the last 2 minutes of the retelling of '86. Those were teams that competed for division titles and pennants right down to the wire every single year. When you persevered with the Mets after 1990, you learned to appreciate the Mets from before 1991 and after 1986. So that those guys were front and center for so much of that. You've seen the montages, you've seen the enormous picture of Dwight Gooden on the side of a building in Manhattan. You've seen
Yep.
the ads that Darryl Strawberry was in. I mean, they were huge stars on top of just being really good players in ways that very few Mets have been since then. Honest to God, other than Mike Piazza, I don't think anybody has really transcended celebrity as outside of the world of Mets fans. And maybe, we don't care. We're Mets fans. They're important to us. But I always like to say about Mike Piazza. Mike Piazza is a Met my sister has heard of. My sister does not follow baseball. Even, in the years of Reyes and Wright and Pete Alonso later and DeGrom, my sister's never heard of any of those people. Strawberry and Gooden were a different story. Those Mets were a different story. Those Mets just mesmerized an entire aptly named metropolitan area, as well as completely overwhelming baseball the way they did. So it always saddens me. Not just their careers could have been better and they went through hell, and I'm really sorry about that. And they're not in the Hall of Fame. Where are their plaques? It saddens me a bit when, if you're ever scrolling through social media and there's just some random picture of one or both of them, that within the first three comments, it's always like, it's a tragedy what happened, it's terrible what happened, they could have been so great. I say, you know what? Take a step back. They were great. Those are amazing careers, intended amazing Mets wise. They did things that I can still see in my mind. They did things that translate onto the baseball reference page. So when this news came down the other day of 18 and 16 getting their due, for all the little, gee, are we really retiring two more numbers? Voices in your head, maybe, and that sense that, well, they were not number 41, therefore nobody is worthy, and that sort of thing. You say, you know what? What is the retirement of numbers for, other than your greatest players and your biggest stars and the personalities who stay with you? We're all rolled into one. And I'm telling you, that's Darryl Strawberry and that's Dwight Gooden to a T.
I don't know how much they realized until they started bringing back the Mets and doing these events, how important they were, to the city, to this team. The Mets were running the 80s. I mean, as much as the Yankees run things now, or they were, the Mets, like your National League town podcast, right? This town was a National League town, and the Mets were the fabric of that. And the 80s was big part of that. Uh, I remember two instances. One of them I was at was the 20th anniversary of the 1986 World Series. And this was the first time that Darryl Strawberry came back with the Mets jersey on to be honored. And the ovation that he got above all of the other players was something that I've never heard. And then you go 2 years into the goodbye Shea, the first time that Doc Gooden comes back. And you know what? I think he even got a louder ovation than, Seaver. And because we always see Seaver, we always see Piazza. It was Dwight Gooden's first time back with the Mets jersey on, and he got a big ovation too. And, at the very least, they are honored by the Mets, which is important to all of us, and they will be immortalized with their numbers being retired.